Look around Nashville right now, and you'll see them everywhere. Tall, narrow houses, side by side, squeezed onto lots that used to hold a brick ranch house. Locals call them tall and skinnies. This series is a secret history behind Nashville's tall and skinnies. The story of a legal loophole that reshaped entire neighborhoods, and what we can build next. To get there, we're going to go back to the 1960s, when a highway and a handful of legal loopholes drew a blueprint. Then we'll follow developers who used that blueprint and built the largest infill movement in the country. Finally, we'll look at the choices that Nashville's facing today and what can come after the tall and skinny era. By the end, you'll know why your street looks like it does today and what it could look like 10 years from now. This is Loophole City, the secret history of Nashville's tall and skinnies. And just so you're oriented, the tall and skinny machine, the condo law, the legal opinion, the moment it all turns from theory into a factory, that's episode 2. Episode 1 is the setup, the prequel, the first cut in the map that makes everything that comes next make sense. October 1967. Edwin Mitchell steps to the lectern in Nashville's council chamber, a civil rights leader who spoke with unflinching professionalism, and in that moment, the only black man in the room with a microphone. He clears his throat and delivers a reckoning on the current state of black Nashvillians. Quote, "Gentlemen, you do not speak for us. The lack of communication embodied an immense divide. Tall buildings which allow you to gaze outward upon the green grass of suburbia cannot long shelter you from the despair, frustration, and bitterness that continue to build around you. In a city that unites its government but leaves its people divided, what brave and unthinking men you are." End quote. Our first glimpse into the power and consequences of loopholes that built Nashville. The first maneuvers became a model, a pattern our city follows to this day, a blueprint, you could call it. What Nashville leaders learned and what developers would later perfect was a blueprint for city building. If the law stands in your way, look for ways around it. And our story begins before Edwin Mitchell's speech, before Metro as we know it today even existed. The story begins with a road you may drive on every day. It begins with Interstate 40. Picture City Hall in 1956. There's 2 buckets of cash that are coming from Washington to redevelop cities. One is urban renewal, and the other is the interstate highway. The difference between the two is where we find our first loophole. The first bucket was urban renewal. It promised to eliminate slums and blighted areas and ensure a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. In practice, it was as much about economics as it was about housing. The program wanted to reverse downtown decline that many cities were experiencing because of white flight. Cities were seeing a migration out to the suburbs from primarily middle-class white families, and their tax revenue was migrating with them. Urban renewal's aim was to modernize and redevelop areas of the city to bring the tax base back from the suburbs. Cities would apply for urban renewal, document the blight in the city, clear the land, and pay 1/3 of the cost, while the federal government paid 2/3 of the cost. That's bucket 1. Bucket 2 was the interstate highway. President Eisenhower at the time launched the largest public works project in U.S. history to build our national highway system. 41,000 miles of highway. In 1956, it was $24.8 billion. Today, that's $295 billion. If a city wanted to build a highway, the state would pay 10% of the cost and 90% federal funding. That's bucket 2. Now put yourself into the mind of a legislator in 1956, reviewing these options. Ignore fatally the human impact, and the loophole comes into focus. The legislator says I can spend 1/3 of the cost on urban renewal or 1/10 of the cost on a highway. But if I can route a highway through a urban renewal target, I can achieve both slum clearance and an easier way to connect suburbs with the city, while Washington pays most of the bill. 2 birds, 1 massive concrete stone. In their mind, the answer was clear. It's time to determine the highway route. Let me show you how this map gets redrawn. It's 1955. The federal government is about to pass the Interstate Highway Bill. Massive government programs, projects 90% covered by Washington, and Nashville wanted to be on that list. So they hire Clark and Rapuano, a New York firm, to draw the route. The firm came back with Plan A. It was an east to west route that was following the existing railroad corridors. Charlotte Avenue, Broadway, smart, right? They were going to reuse the railroads right away with minimal demolition and minimal disruption. But the state and the city looked at the map and saw a problem. The route ran too close to Belmead, Vanderbilt, Centennial Park, and All White Hospital, all the institutions that mattered to the people in power. So they said, move it. So the planners redraw the line. They push it a mile north, a small kink on the map. A surgical move. By July 1955, just 2 months later, the final plan is presented to the Planning Commission. I-40 was now aimed at North Nashville, through Jefferson Street, a black neighborhood. And here's what the internal memos from that period reveal. The planners didn't hide their logic. They paired the highways with slum clearance. One memo even urged aiming the highway system like a gun at the heart of the slums. Those are their words, not a metaphor. A gun aimed at a black neighborhood. But routing a highway through a neighborhood isn't like drawing a line on paper. Congress requires a public hearing. The law is clear. The people affected get a say. So Tennessee technically complied in the way Nashville knows best. Loopholes. May 15th, 1957. The state schedules the hearing. Notices go up, but only in post offices in white neighborhoods. No newspaper announcement. The flyers, they list the wrong date. May 14th. The hearing is May 15th. By the time some people realize the correct date, it's over. The hearing transcript is incomplete. Some historical accounts even suggest that the Charlotte Avenue alignment, the original route, was the one that was actually discussed, not the Jefferson Street route that would actually be built. Black Nashvillians, those affected, they weren't even there. The box was checked. Congress was satisfied. The law was followed, technically, but the spirit, gone. By late 1958, the Federal Highway Administration signs off. The route through North Nashville is approved, official, federal. Then silence. 7 years of silence, 1958 to 1965. The highway exists on paper, in offices and filed documents, but nothing happens. No bulldozers, no announcements, no meetings. For 7 years, the state tells concerned citizens it's preliminary, subject to change. We don't know when and we don't know where exactly. One highway planner even tells people, we can't give out that information. In fact, we don't know any of the designs or the plans. So how do you move a massive project through a neighborhood without resistance? Not with force, with silence, with partial truths, with the letter of the law, not the spirit, with loopholes. While the highway sat dormant on paper, Nashville faced a second crisis, one that would force a different kind of loophole. The tax base was leaving. In the 1950s and 60s, white flight swelled in the suburbs. Families moved beyond city limits to Williamson County, Rutherford, Wilson, Sumner. They wanted lower taxes and new houses, and they got both. But here's the problem. The city had to fund streets, parks, libraries, infrastructure used by these suburban residents. Those residents drove into the city, they worked downtown, but they paid taxes in their county, not to Nashville. The math was unsustainable. Listen to these numbers because it really puts into perspective what was going on. From 1950 to 1960, Williamson County grew 69%, Rutherford County 41%, Wilson County 51%, Sumner 53%. And the city's tax base was dwindled. Davidson County historian Carol Busey put it this way, quote, "While vast development occurred in the county, the city's tax base began to erode. The county could not provide its residents who lived outside the city limits adequate urban services, such as sewers. Fire protection in the county was provided only as a private service to those residents who contracted for it. The sheriff was the law enforcement authority in the county." End quote. The suburbs wanted city services without paying for them. Nashville's Mayor Ben West and Judge Beverly Briley faced a choice: fix it mathematically or watch the city collapse. They devised a strategy. 2 moves, a carrot and a stick. The carrot came first. In 1958, they pitched consolidation with the suburbs. One government, one plan. Merge the city with the outer counties, modernize services, and bring the tax base back under one roof. Sounds reasonable. Sounds fair. The suburbs said no. Why would they? They had low taxes. They had everything the city provided without paying for it. Suburban taxpayers weren't about to vote themselves into a higher tax rate. Even black leaders in downtown Nashville voted no. They didn't trust the early council design. Not enough seats at the table. Not enough representation. The carrot didn't work. So, Ben West played the stick. In less than a year, the city invoked a 1950s Tennessee annexation law. No referendum, no vote, no public meeting. Legally airtight, ethically engineered. The city walked into the suburbs and said, "You are part of the city now." 42 square miles, 82,000 residents annexed. Then they threw a $10 green sticker wheel tax, which was added to every commuter entering the city. The city then delivered almost no new services, just higher taxes. Anger boiled everywhere, and the suburbs erupted. But here's what West accomplished. He forced a decision. Negotiate consolidation on our terms, or we'll swallow you piecemeal. Keep getting annexed until there's nothing left to negotiate. The suburbs understood the threat. Annexation would continue. They'd lose autonomy strip by strip. Better negotiate a deal. So they came back to the table. First, a 40-member Metro Council, 35 districts, 5 at-large members, and crucially, with mapped districts that included majority black neighborhoods. The black leaders who rejected consolidation in 1958, now they had seats. Real seats. Real representation. Second, there was a 2-tier system, which we still see today. The Urban Services District, which was full city services, full city taxes, and the General Services District. Lower taxes, fewer services, until the city could build out to them. It was a compromise, a forced one, but a deal both sides could live with. In 1962, consolidation passed, and Judge Beverly Briley, the leader of the pro-consolidation movement, became the first mayor of consolidated Nashville. And Nashville became the first city in the country to consolidate urban downtown with the outer suburbs. And now Nashville had something it never had before. One mayor, one council, and one unified planning apparatus. That didn't just streamline government. It rewrote the map of power. Remember that highway sitting in the filing cabinet since 1958? The Federal Highway Administration had already approved the I-40 route through North Nashville. Now Metro had everything it needed: legal cover, federal money, and the votes to push the project through localized opposition. They had the keys, and they already had the target. They looked north and made their decision. The interstate would be built. 90% federal money. Urban renewal. Eliminate blight. Before Metro Council, a road through Jefferson Street had to survive a city-only fight, where black neighborhoods and their allies had real leverage. After Metro, Those same voters were diluted into a county-wide electorate of new suburban homeowners who wanted a fast interstate downtown. Around the country, you could see what happened when the politics flipped the other way. In Memphis, for example, a planned stretch of I-40 through Overton Park would eventually be stopped by a well-organized, mostly white, middle-class neighborhood revolt that went all the way to the Supreme Court and won. North Nashville didn't have that kind of clout. No citywide park, no wealthy white neighborhood, and after consolidation, even a fully mobilized Jefferson Street was swimming against a new suburban tide. But here's the truth they wouldn't say out loud. North Nashville wasn't blight. It was the opposite. It was the center, the beating heart of Black Nashville. If you walked Jefferson Street in the 1950s and 60s, you wouldn't have called it blight. You would have called it culture. Fisk University, Meharry Medical College, Hadley Park, the first public park for Black Nashvillians, the Bijou Theater, Mount Zion Baptist Church, the largest church in the city, all concentrated on one corridor, all thriving. The clubs, Club Baron, the Del Morocco, Maceos, they became legendary. Etta James played there, Jimi Hendrix, Little Richard. The music scene didn't just reflect the development of rock and R&B, it created it. This is where Nashville's civil rights movement was born. Marion Barry, John Lewis, Diane Nash, they launched the public sit-ins from Clark Memorial Methodist right there on Jefferson Street. 3 universities, hundreds of Black-owned businesses, a cultural mecca, an educated elite, and a thriving middle class. This is what the state called blight. So how was there no fight from the community? They didn't know it was coming. For 7 years, 1958 to 1965, policymakers gave careful, calculated lies. They said things like, it's preliminary, it's subject to change, we don't know when and we don't know where. Land surveyors putting stakes in the ground said there's no cause for alarm. Meanwhile, real estate speculators knew exactly where the highway was going. By 1967, the community finally organized the I-40 Steering Committee, led by Fisk and TSU professors, including Edwin Mitchell. But it was too late. The machinery was already in motion. They fought. They proposed an alternate route. They called it the river route. It would have avoided Jefferson Street entirely and followed the river further north. It would have spared the district. But the state refused. Why? Because they could implement urban renewal. And urban renewal meant federal money for demolition. Now we see this Inception-like loophole. Loopholes within loopholes. The route's location could not have been crueler. The state didn't run the highway straight through Jefferson Street, because that would have triggered business compensation rules, forced them to pay Black business owners for lost income. Way too expensive. Instead, they ran the highway just behind the businesses, up to the back lot lines. Technically, the storefronts stayed intact, but intact meant nothing. The customers couldn't reach them. The highway became a concrete wall. Edwin Mitchell, standing where he stood before Nashville's power structure, put it simply. Quote, superhighways form concrete moats between Negro and white communities. End quote. Mitchell and the steering committee took it to court. The judge acknowledged the planning hearing had been entirely inadequate and filled with irregularities, but nevertheless ruled against the steering committee. The judge also said this, and listen to how perfectly it encapsulates the loophole logic. Quote, most of the evidence presented by the plaintiff goes to the wisdom and not legality of the highway department's decision. End quote. In other words, yes, this is a terrible policy, but legal. We won't stop it. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case. The $6 million construction contract was awarded. The results were swift and predictable. hundreds of homes demolished, dozens of streets dead-ended, over 1,000 people displaced, predominantly black. 3 universities walled off from their neighborhoods, businesses closed, culture interrupted, a community fractured. That's what the deviation cost them. And a district that had thrived for generations became a monument to what power can destroy when no one has the power to stop it. This is the blueprint. 1 mile north. That's the difference between what could have been and what was destroyed. Here's what I need you to understand. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't even cruelty in the way we usually understand it. This was a system working exactly as designed. The state used procedure as a weapon. They scheduled a hearing in white neighborhoods with the wrong date. They complied with the law technically. They followed the letter while breaking the spirit. That's not failure, that's precision. The city used coercion as a tool. They annexed the suburbs without a vote. They added a wheel tax without consent. They forced a choice: negotiate or lose everything. That's not accident, that's strategy. And the courts used legality as a shield. The judge said it himself: the hearing was entirely inadequate and filled with irregularities. He acknowledged the injustice. Then he ruled against the people anyways, because technically, legally, the state complied. 3 institutions, 3 moves, same logic. Find the loophole, exploit it, move on. And it worked. But here's what matters. Edwin Mitchell saw it clearly. He stood in that council chamber in 1967 and named it, not because he blamed individuals, but because he understood what was happening. He saw the system, he saw the loophole, and he named it so others could see it too. The highway became exactly what he said: a barrier between North Nashville and the rest of the city, a physical manifestation of legal loopholes that made its construction possible. This is the blueprint that Nashville learned. Because the system rewarded those who read the law carefully, who saw the gaps, who understood that the letter of the law means more than the spirit. And once you understand this blueprint, you start seeing it everywhere in Nashville. Understanding this isn't about assigning blame to dead politicians or judging decisions made 50 years ago. It's about understanding how the system works so you can recognize when it happens again. Because it does happen again. In the 1990s, a different kind of entrepreneur started watching Nashville. Not mayors or planners, developers. But they started asking a different question. Not how do we destroy a neighborhood, but how do we increase density with the least amount of resistance? And they found a law written in 1963, forgotten, dormant. And from 1990 to today, a 1-sentence loophole shaped Nashville more than any government plan, more than any policy debate, more than any democratic process. It's in your neighborhood right now. You've seen them. 2 narrow houses squeezed onto 1 lot. 3 stories tall, barely any yard, side by side or stacked front and back. Locals call them tall and skinnies. Developers call them HPRs, horizontal property regimes. They're everywhere. Green Hills, the Nations, East Nashville, Wedgwood, Houston, Cleveland Park. And if you want to understand how a city actually changes, not through grand plans and government mandates, but through loopholes and clever lawyers and developers watching closely, you need to understand how a loophole built 20,000 homes in under a decade. This is Loophole City, the secret history of Nashville's tall and skinnies.